Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are wrestling with, well, one of the biggest challenges facing global conservation right now, biological invasions.
Mm-hmm.
Alongside things like climate change and habitat loss, these invasive species are just fundamentally reshaping entire ecosystems. They're driving biodiversity loss and, honestly, causing staggering economic burdens everywhere.
Absolutely. We're talking billions easily.
Yeah, it's not just about losing species. It's a massive financial drain, too.
And the complexity is just
Hmm.
immense. I mean, think about the sheer range. You've got everything from, say, a microscopic fungus that can wipe out entire amphibian populations,
Right.
all the way up to, like, a huge invasive tree that completely re-engineers how water chemistry works in a river system.
Wow.
The variety, and especially how these impacts connect and cascade, it makes them incredibly hard to consistently document, let alone quantify or manage effectively.
It sounds like a real information bottleneck in conservation, if everyone's describing the problem differently.
Exactly. It's kind of an information crisis,
Right.
really. How do you manage something if you can't even agree on how to describe its effects?
And that brings us right to the core of the research we're unpacking today. For a long time, researchers have used classification frameworks like EICAT, maybe you've heard of it.
Yeah.
But this new paper argues that these systems, well, they're just not quite cutting it. They're not capturing the full picture. What's the main problem they're trying to fix here?
Well, it's really sort of two main things, structure and scope. Now, we absolutely have to give credit where it's due. Early efforts like GIS, the Generic Impact Scoring System, and especially EICAT.
The environmental impact classification for alien taxa.
That's the one. EICAT particularly, it got standardized, adopted
Yeah.
by the IUCN, which was a huge step. But its scope, well, it's inherently limited. It really only focuses on documented impacts on native biodiversity.
So impacts on species, populations, communities, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So let's say you have an invasive grass species, and it dries out the soil in a native forest, making it way more prone to massive wildfires.
Okay.
The ICAT might completely miss that impact because it's not directly affecting, say, a native animal population count in the short term.
Ah, I see. So it misses those fundamental changes to the environment itself.
Precisely. It tends to exclude these really crucial impacts on ecosystem processes. Think nutrient cycling, water availability, and especially abiotic changes. Changes to the non-living stuff like water, soil, fire patterns, even local climate.
Okay, but the paper says it goes deeper than just scope, right? Something about confusing causes and effects.
Yes, and this is, I think, the really critical insight. The authors argue that a lot of the existing classifications tend to muddle up the causes of the disruption with the consequences. They mix up mechanisms and impacts, often treating them almost like the same thing.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this distinction sounds key. What makes this new approach so essential here? It seems simple on paper, mechanism versus impact, but are researchers really struggling with this in practice?
They absolutely are, largely because the term impact has just been used so loosely for so long. You'll see older studies listing things like predation or competition or disease transmission as an impact.
Right.
This new framework says, hold on, no, those aren't the impacts, those are the mechanisms. They're the disruptive interactions, the actions the invasive species takes. They're the cause.
Got it. The mechanism is the action the invader takes.
Exactly. The impacts, on the other hand, are the measurable consequences that result from that mechanism. They're the outcomes you can actually observe and quantify at different ecological levels, individual, population, ecosystem, and so on.
So separating cause from consequence is the big conceptual leap they're pushing for.
That's the heart of it.
Can you give us a really clear example, maybe use a famous case study to illustrate that difference?
Sure thing. Let's take the classic, really devastating case of the brown tree snake, Boiga irregularis, in Guam. Everyone knows this one.
Oh, yeah, terrible story.
The mechanism, the disruptive interaction, is direct predation. The snake eats the native birds. Now, if a study just listed predation as the impact, you're missing the real story, the severity. The impact, the actual consequence of that predation, is species loss. It's the extirpation, the local extinction of almost all of Guam's native forest birds.
Ah, okay, so
Sure.
mechanism, predation, impact, species loss, extinction, very different levels of information.
Totally different. And
Yeah.
focusing on the consequence, the impact, is so critical because your management response might change dramatically depending on what that outcome is, even if the initial mechanism, say, predation is the same.
Right, this is where it gets practical, not just academic theory.
Exactly. Take predation again. Think about invasive mammals in Australia, European red foxes, feral cats. Both are predators, that's the mechanism.
Okay.
But the resulting impacts on native marsupials and birds, they vary hugely. For one species, the consequence might just be a measurable decline in population size. For another, it might be a severe contraction of its range. And for the most vulnerable, the impact is outright species loss.
And you'd manage each of those situations differently, presumably. Trying to boost numbers is different from protecting the last refuge, which is different from captive breeding for a species facing extinction.
Precisely. This new framework lets us categorize those different consequences with much more precision.
I get it now. And if the big global databases like GISD or the FABI Invasive Species Compendium are just cataloging data by species, but using this inconsistent, fuzzy language for the outcomes, then comparing across different invaders or different ecosystems must be incredibly difficult, almost impossible to get a big picture view.
It's a major barrier. These species-specific approaches, coupled with inconsistent terminology, lead to huge problems in categorization. If one paper calls predation the impact and another calls species loss the impact for the same interaction, how do you combine that data meaningfully?
You can't, really.
Right. So by standardizing the language around the consequences, these 19 impact types we're going to talk about, we create a kind of universal measuring stick. We can then actually compare the ecological effects of, say, an invasive plant in Europe to an invasive fish in North America.
Which helps researchers see bigger patterns and allows managers to prioritize where the worst consequences are happening, regardless of the specific invader.
Exactly. It facilitates much better global data harmonization and helps focus limited resources on the most severe outcomes.
Okay, that makes the mission really clear. Create common, standardized language for talking about invasion impacts globally. So let's get into Section 2. How do they actually build this list, this comprehensive typology of 19 ecological impacts? Getting global consensus on definitions for things like soundscape or fire regime sounds challenging.
Oh, it was incredibly rigorous. And that rigor is really what gives this paper its authority. They didn't just make up a list. They started by doing a massive literature review, just compiling every existing concept of impact they could find, from studies on plants, animals, aquatic systems, terrestrial systems, everything.
Trying to capture the whole universe of potential effects.
Exactly. And the goal was to create a list that was, 1, exhaustive, covering everything, 2, simple, easy to understand and use, and 3, crucially, mutually exclusive, meaning the categories don't overlap in confusing ways. You can clearly place an observed impact into one and only one category.
Okay, so they had a draft list from the literature. How did they refine that and get everyone to agree? Getting 60 experts to sign off on anything sounds like herding cats.
Yeah, well, they used a very specific structured method called the Delphi process. Have you heard of it?
Vaguely. It's for reaching consensus, right?
Exactly. It's designed for situations where you need expert agreement, but maybe the objective data is patchy, or the definitions themselves are up for debate, which is perfect for this kind of challenge.
So how does it work in practice?
They took their initial synthesized list of impact types and definitions and sent it out anonymously to 60 leading experts in biological invasions from all over the world. Diverse group.
Anonymously is key, I guess. Stops people just agreeing with the big names.
Right. People feel freer to give honest feedback. So these experts rated the clarity, the usefulness, the comprehensiveness of each definition and provided detailed comments.
Okay, round 1. Then what?
Then the research team collected all that feedback, synthesized it, and crucially, showed the group results back to the experts. They highlighted where there was agreement, but also where there was disagreement or confusion.
So everyone sees the collective thinking.
Yes. And then they went for a second round. The experts were asked to review the aggregated feedback and reconsider their initial ratings and comments, maybe refine their position based on what others had said. The goal is to iteratively move the whole group towards a strong consensus.
Iterative meaning multiple rounds of feedback and refinement.
Precisely. 2 rounds in this case. And through that structured back and forth, they managed to achieve broad consensus on this final list of 19 distinct, well-defined, mutually exclusive ecological impact types.
Wow. Okay, so getting 60 top experts to agree on this framework, That gives it enormous weight. It really does feel like it could become the standard.
That's definitely the hope, and I think the process justifies it. Now, importantly, these 19 types aren't just a random list. They're organized very logically along two main axes, which gives the whole framework a really robust structure.
Okay, let's break down that structure. What's the first axis?
The first is maybe the more intuitive one. Axis 1 is 6 levels of ecological organization. This basically scales the impacts hierarchically, from the smallest, most localized effects up to the broadest environmental shifts.
So like zooming out from a single organism to the whole landscape.
Exactly. The levels are.
Individual organism level affecting a single plant or animal's health, reproduction, or behavior.
Okay, the micro level.
2. Population level affecting the numbers, density, or genetic makeup of a group of the same species.
Group level.
3. Species level affecting the geographic range or the very existence, the persistence of an entire species.
A whole species.
4. Assemblage level. This is about the community, affecting the mix of different species, the diversity, the interactions within a habitat.
Community level. Got it.
5. Ecosystem function service level. Now we're talking big processes like primary production, nutrient cycling, pollination, water filtration, things the whole system does.
The machinery of the ecosystem.
And finally, 6. The abiotic environment itself affecting the non-living components, like water cycles, soil properties, fire regimes, local climate.
Okay, that hierarchical structure makes a lot of sense. It forces you to think about how an impact at, say, the individual level.
Like reduced fitness.
Yeah, how that might eventually ripple up and cause changes at the ecosystem, or even the abiotic level decades later. It builds in that cascading idea.
Precisely. And the second axis, axis 2, systems ecology components. This one is perhaps the more theoretically profound development. It explicitly links invasion biology to broader ecosystem theory.
How so? What does that mean in practice?
It means that each of those 19 impact types is also categorized based on which fundamental component of the ecosystem it disrupts, according to systems ecology principles. This helps integrate invasion impacts into how we model and understand ecosystems more generally.
Okay, so we're looking beyond just what happened to what fundamental process got broken. What are these components?
There are 4 main ones they use.
Energy flow. Impacts that disrupt how energy moves through the system. Think changes in primary production or altering food web dynamics, who eats whom.
Okay, energy transfer.
2. Mass. Impacts related to changes in physical matter. This could be altering nutrient cycles, changing the physical structure of habitats, modifying soil chemistry, or water availability.
Physical stuff, got it.
3. Information flow. This is about shifts in signals, cues, interactions. Things like changes in animal behavior, disruptions to pollination networks, interference with chemical signaling, even changes to the soundscape.
The communication network of the ecosystem.
You could think of it that way, yeah. And 4, information storage. This primarily relates to the loss of biological information, essentially. Genetic diversity loss through hybridization or species diversity loss through extinction. The irreversible loss of the blueprints.
Wow. Okay, linking invasion impacts directly to these core systems. Ecology components, energy, mass, information flow, information storage, that feels really powerful. It means, like you said, a manager dealing with an invasive mussel in a lake can potentially compare the functional impact to someone dealing with an invasive grass in a desert, even though the species and habitats are totally different.
Exactly. If both invasions are primarily disrupting, say, nutrient cycling mass or altering food webs, energy flow,
Yeah.
they can learn from each other's management approaches in a way that wasn't really possible before. It provides a common functional language.
Right, let's dive into the specifics then. Section 3, walking through these 19 impact types using those 6 ecological levels as our guide. This is the toolkit people will actually be using, so let's get a feel for the kind of precision it offers. We'll start small, at level I, individual organism.
Okay, so at level I, we're looking at those often subtle early warning signs within a single organism. The first type, type 1, is fitness and/or reproduction. This is about measurable changes in an individual's ability to survive and, crucially, to reproduce successfully.
What's a good example? Something concrete.
Yeah, a really clear one comes from Tahiti. There's an invasive plant there, Myconia cavescens, a big shrub. Studies found it significantly reduces the fertility, the seed production of native understory trees growing nearby.
So the native trees are still there, they look okay, maybe, but they're just not reproducing as well because of the invader.
Exactly. It's a subtle hit to their reproductive output. And in the systems ecology terms, that's messing with information flow, how the plant allocates resources for reproduction.
Okay. Type 2 is health and/or growth, so direct physical condition impacts.
Right, adverse effects on physical condition, vigor, growth rate. A common example involves invasive insects that act as vectors for non-native diseases, like fungal pathogens.
Ah, bringing diseases with them.
Yep. These pathogens can then attack native trees, significantly reducing their growth rate and overall health or vigor. That's a direct impact on the organism's physical structure, its mass.
And type 3 is behavioral. This one feels particularly interesting because behavior can be so fluid. Shifts in actions, activities, responses.
Yeah, and we see some fascinating examples here, like native Eurasian red squirrels. When they get infected by a non-native parasite carried by gray squirrels, they show reduced activity levels. They become less active.
Just sort of lethargic.
Seems like it. Or another one. European roe deer have been observed to decrease their feeding time and increase their vigilance, like nervously looking around more when they're near areas with introduced fallow deer.
So the mere presence of the invader changes their behavior, making them spend less time eating and more time stressed.
Precisely. They're expending precious energy on being alert instead of foraging, all because the invader is nearby. And that's a disruption of information flow, their perception and response to risk cues in the environment.
Okay, that covers the individual level. Moving up the hierarchy now to level 2, population. This is where we scale up from one organism to the group.
Right. Focusing on a single species within a defined area. Type 4 is probably the one people think of most often. Population size. Simple changes, usually reductions, but sometimes increases in the number of individuals.
The classic example being,
Oh, the crayfish plague. Aphanomius acetacea. An invasive water mold that caused and still causes huge mass mortality events in native European crayfish populations. Just decimates their numbers. That's a very direct loss of mass at the population level.
Brutal. Okay, and type 5 is genetic diversity. This feels more insidious, maybe.
It definitely can be, because it's often less visible but potentially has very long-term consequences. This is about reducing the genetic variation within a population, often through things like hybridization or integration, where the invader's genes mix with the natives.
Diluting the native gene pool.
Exactly. A good example is the invasive European barbel fish in Italy. It's hybridizing extensively with native barbel species, leading to significant genetic integration and threatening the genetic integrity, maybe even the existence, of the native forms.
And this leads to loss of unique adaptations.
Potentially, yes. Another example is the Nile tilapia introduction, which, through hybridization, has led to the almost complete loss of the distinct genetic signature of a native tilapia species, Oreochromis mortimeri, in Lake Kariba. The native genetic information is effectively erased. It's lots of information storage.
Okay, then we get to level 3, species. Now we're looking at the entire species across its whole range, its ultimate fate.
Right, type 6 is species range. This covers shifts in the geographical distribution. Either the native species range contracts, or sometimes an invasive pushes a native species to expand into suboptimal areas.
The classic UK example here must be the red squirrel versus the gray squirrel.
Absolutely. The dramatic contraction of the native Eurasian red squirrel's range across the UK and parts of Europe, largely due to replacement by the invasive eastern gray squirrel, is a prime case of type 6 impact. It's partly competition, partly disease. But the result is a range shift. Functionally, it's an information flow issue the native can't access or thrive in its former niche.
And type 7 is the end game. Species loss, extinction or extirpation.
Yes, the most severe and irreversible consequence at the species level. This is where our brown tree snake example lands. The predation mechanism led to the type 7 impact of species loss for Guam's birds. Once you hit level 3 impacts like range collapse or extinction, recovery is incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
Okay, that leads us logically up to level 4, assemblage. This is the community level, thinking about multiple species interacting together.
Correct. Type 8 is assemblage structure. This covers changes in how the community is put together, alterations in diversity metrics. Alpha diversity, local richness, beta diversity, turnover between sites, gamma diversity, regional richness, and also relative abundances.
Is the main pattern here that things become more similar everywhere? Homogenization.
That's a very common and worrying pattern, yes. Look at freshwater fish faunas across the continental U.S. Because certain non-native species like carp or bass have been introduced so widely, the fish communities in different rivers and lakes have become much more similar to each other than they were historically.
So you lose that unique local character.
Exactly. It's biotic homogenization. The overall diversity might not even decrease everywhere, but the distinctiveness is lost. That's an erosion of local information storage.
Type 9 is successional patterns. This sounds quite technical, altering the sequence of how ecosystems develop over time.
It is a bit technical, but incredibly important for long-term ecosystem trajectory. Succession is the natural process of change in species composition over time, like how a forest regrows after a fire. Some invasives completely mess this up. Well, there's an example from Tennessee where non-native plants were found to disrupt the interactions between native species. They essentially accelerated the successional process, pushing the ecosystem faster towards a state dominated by non-native woody species, preventing the native community from establishing properly. They're changing the future mass and structure of that entire forest system.
And type 10, soundscape. This feels like a very modern inclusion, focusing on the acoustic environment.
It is, and it really shows the breadth of this framework, particularly how it captures information flow. Invasive plants like spotted knapweed can degrade habitat quality for certain birds, like chipping sparrows. This results in fewer birds singing less diverse songs. The acoustic richness of the environment itself is diminished.
So the lack of birdsong is an impact in itself.
Yes. Or another example, invasive cane toads in Australia. Their calls can actively interfere with the communication systems of native frogs, making it harder for them to find mates. That's a direct disruption of information flow, crucial for reproduction.
Fascinating. Okay, moving up again to Level V Ecosystem Function Service. Now we're at the big scale, affecting processes that underpin the whole system and often things humans rely on.
Exactly. Type 11 is primary production. This is about changes in the rate at which biomass is produced, usually by plants or algae capturing sunlight. This can go down, maybe due to competition from invasives shading out natives, or it can go up.
Go up. How?
Think about nutrient pollution often associated with human activity, which can fuel invasive algal blooms in lakes or coastal waters. These blooms represent a massive increase in primary production, but it's often detrimental overall. Either way, it's a fundamental change in energy flow.
Right. Type 12 is ecological function. This covers impairment of those vital background processes like nutrient cycling or pollination.
Yes, this is where you see impacts on the machinery. A classic example is invasive pollinators, like the European honeybee in some contexts, outcompeting native pollinators. If the native pollinators decline, this can lead to reduced reproductive success for native plants that relied on them. That disrupts pollination, a key ecosystem service.
Which links back to information flow, pollinator cues, and eventually energy flow, plant reproduction.
Exactly. Or you might have invasive plants with allelopathic chemicals, chemicals that harm other plants, disrupting the soil microbial communities that are essential for nutrient cycling. That impairs a fundamental function.
Type 13, food web changes, altering who eats whom, the trophic structure.
Right. Changes in trophic interactions, maybe adding a new type predator, or disrupting links lower down. The invasive lake trout in some North American lakes is a powerful example. It didn't just slot in, it fundamentally reorganized the food web.
How so?
It directly competes with native predators like bull trout, sometimes pushing them to feed on different things. And it also preys heavily on other native fish, changing the whole pattern of energy flow through the lake ecosystem.
And type 14, habitat or refugia, this is about the physical space.
Yes, the deterioration or outright disappearance of critical habitats or safe places. Refugia that native species need. Think of invasive marsh grasses like Spartina alterniflora spreading across mudflats. They physically transform the habitat, making it unsuitable for native shorebirds that need open mud to feed or nest. That's a change in physical mass, the structure of the ecosystem.
Okay, finally, the highest level, level 6, the abiotic environment, affecting the non-living matrix.
Right. Type 15 is hydrology, water, quality, soil, moisture. Anything related to water. Some invasive plants, like tamarisk or mesquite in arid regions, are notorious water hogs.
They use way more water than natives.
Way more. Their high transpiration rates can significantly lower the water table, reduce soil moisture, and decrease stream runoff, fundamentally changing the water balance of an entire landscape. That's a large-scale change in the distribution of mass water. Or think of zebra mussels in the Hudson River. Their filter feeding dramatically increased water clarity, but also led to declines in dissolved oxygen in some areas, altering water quality.
Okay. Type 16 is nutrient pool and fluxes, changes in nutrient availability or cycling.
Yes. This often involves ecosystem engineers. A wild example is the introduced hippopotamus population in Colombia. Yes, hippos in Colombia.
Seriously, Escobar's hippos.
Those are the ones. They graze on land but spend a lot of time in water, defecating. They act as massive pumps, importing terrestrial organic matter and nutrients into the aquatic systems at unnatural rates. This profoundly impacts the water chemistry, ecosystem metabolism, nutrient cycling, a huge alteration of mass cycling.
Wow. Okay, type 17 fire regime. This is a big one in many parts of the world.
Huge, especially in grasslands, shrublands, dry forests. This refers to changes in the frequency, intensity, seasonality, or spatial patterns of wildfires. Many invasive grasses, for example, are highly flammable and cure quickly.
Creating more fuel more often.
Exactly. They can invade native ecosystems that weren't adapted to frequent fire, leading to a grass fire cycle that increases fire frequency and intensity, often preventing native woody species from recovering. That's a massive shift in the disturbance regime, affecting energy release and ecosystem structure.
Type 18 soil sediment. Changes to the ground itself.
Yep, physical, chemical, or biological properties of the soil or sediment. Some invasive plants can change soil pH or alter the availability of certain nutrients, or even increase the bioavailability of heavy metals, making the soil unsuitable for natives. Or invasive earthworms can dramatically alter soil structure and litter decomposition rates. Again, a fundamental change in mass composition and structure.
And finally, type 19, completing the list, microclimate. Changes in local climate conditions.
Exactly. This is often at a very local scale, but can be critical. Think of a dense stand of an invasive shrub, like Himalayan balsam, Impatiens glandulifera. It creates deep shade beneath its canopy.
Cutting out light for native seedlings.
Yes, but also altering the local temperature and humidity on the forest floor right underneath it. This change in microclimate can then impact survival or activity of other organisms living there, like snails, insects, or soil microbes. It's a localized change in mass, shade blocking energy, humidity affecting water vapor, that creates a different environment.
Phew, that's quite a list. 19 distinct types scaled across 6 levels and linked back to those 4 core system components.
Yeah.
It really feels like a comprehensive, structured way to think about the whole spectrum of invasion impacts.
It absolutely is. It gives the field that standardized toolkit it's been needing.
But, as you mentioned earlier, these impacts rarely happen in isolation. They often trigger chain reactions. Let's spend some time on Section 4, digging into these cascading effects, the move from immediate proximal impacts to the longer-term distal consequences.
Right. This is where it gets really complex, but also where understanding the full picture becomes so critical. The idea is that the initial direct impact, the proximal one, maybe at the individual or population level, can set off a whole series of downstream effects. The domino effect.
Exactly. And these distal impacts can ripple across multiple levels of our hierarchy, sometimes even crossing ecosystem boundaries, and often playing out over much longer timescales.
So the framework helps us track that whole chain reaction, not just the first domino to fall.
That's the goal. Let's use that disease example again, the amphibian chytrid fungus, because it illustrates such a dramatic cascade, even reaching humans.
Okay, refresh my memory. Invasive amphibians carry the fungus.
Right. The fungus causes high mortality in many native amphibian species. That's the proximal impact type 2, health, leading to type 4, population size, and potentially type 7, species loss. Individual population species levels hit hard.
Okay, first few dominoes.
But then follow the chain. In some parts of Central America, the subsequent decline or extinction of these native amphibians, which were major predators of insects.
They ate mosquitoes. Among other things, yes. The removal led to a significant alteration in the food web, type 13, and a change in assemblage structure, type 8. Specifically, in some areas, it caused a dramatic increase in mosquito populations because a key predator was gone.
Okay, more mosquitoes. That's bad. But where's the huge distal impact?
The most shocking distal consequence reported from some studies was an observed increase in the incidence of mosquito-borne diseases like malaria in nearby human populations.
Wait, hang on. So an invasive fungus killing frogs in a forest ultimately led to more people getting malaria, miles away potentially.
That's the reported cascade.
Yeah.
It's staggering, isn't it? That single invasion event rippled from individual health impacts all the way up through population, species, assemblage, food web changes, and ultimately impacted human health, which isn't even formally in the ecological framework, but is a societal consequence.
Wow, that perfectly illustrates why you need this comprehensive view. If you'd only studied the frogs and documented the type 4 population decline, you would have completely missed the connection to malaria risk.
Completely. And we see similar, though maybe less dramatic, consequence chains with plants too. Imagine a proximal impact is a decline in native flowering plants due to competition. Type 4, population size.
Okay.
That could cascade to disrupt their specialized native pollinators. Type 12, ecological function impacting pollination. which in turn could alter the broader insect diversity in the area, type 8 assemblage structure, perhaps affecting birds that eat those insects and generally eroding the pollination service over the long term. One impact triggers another across levels.
The complexity just keeps building, and it gets even messier when the invaders themselves bring other organisms with them, like parasites or pathogens. The paper talks about the pathobiome complicating things.
Yeah, this is a real headache for assessment, because the relationship isn't always straightforwardly negative for the invader. Sometimes, counterintuitively, an invasive parasite might actually reduce the impact of its invasive host.
How? It makes the invader sick.
Exactly. It could act almost like a natural biological control on the invader itself. But much more commonly, the invasive parasite or pathogen spills over and starts infecting native species. Then it causes its own set of impacts on native health, type 2, population size, type 4, etc.
So the parasite becomes an invader in its own right?
Essentially, yes. And the classic red squirrel versus gray squirrel situation in the UK is a perfect, if tragic, illustration of this whole mess.
Right. We mentioned the gray squirrel outcompeting the red.
Yes, there's definitely classical competition happening that's a mechanism leading potentially to a type 6 impact range contraction for the red squirrel. But the gray squirrel also carries the squirrel pox virus.
Which doesn't really harm the gray, but is lethal to the reds.
Devastatingly lethal. It massively accelerates the decline of the native red squirrel, pushing it towards local extinction, type 7 impact, much faster than competition alone likely would have.
So the overall impact on the red squirrel, its disappearance, is driven by both competition and disease spread. But how do you disentangle which mechanism is more important?
That is the million-dollar research question the paper flags. Is the gray squirrel just a carrier of the invasive virus, essentially a vector spreading another harmful agent? Or should we view the spread of the virus by the gray squirrel as part of the gray squirrel's own impact, maybe through something called apparent competition mediated by the pathogen?
What's apparent competition?
It's when two species negatively affect each other indirectly, through a shared enemy in this case. The virus benefiting from the presence of both susceptible reds and tolerant grays. The paper basically argues the literature needs to be much clearer about which mechanism they think is operating.
And this framework helps by forcing researchers to first clearly define the observed impact, like species loss, type 7, and then work backwards to rigorously investigate the relative contributions of the different potential mechanisms, like direct competition versus disease transmission.
Exactly. It provides the structure for that investigation.
And this typology is also crucial for spotting impacts that jump between ecosystems, right? Those cross-ecosystem interactions you mentioned.
Yes, these are so easy to miss if you're only studying, say, the forest, or only studying the stream next to it. But the framework helps flag them because we're tracking changes in fundamental things like energy and mass flows, which often cross boundaries. Level 6 impacts can reflect this.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Think about invasive willow trees, Salix species, that were introduced along rivers in Australia. They grew densely and changed the structure of the vegetation right along the banks. That's a terrestrial impact, maybe type 14 habitat change.
Okay, changing the riverside plants.
But that had knock-on effects in the stream. The dense willows increased the amount of leaf litter falling into the water and also shaded the stream more heavily than the native vegetation did.
So more leaves, less light in the water.
Right. Less light suppressed the growth of algae in the stream. That's an aquatic type 11 impact, primary production decrease. The increased leaf litter, meanwhile, shifted the stream's food web. Instead of being based on algae, it became more reliant on processing dead leaves detritus.
So the whole energy source for the aquatic insects changed?
Exactly. The energy flow shifted from algal-based to detritus-based. And this, in turn, changed the community structure, favoring detritus-eating macroinvertebrates and suppressing algae grazers and the fungi associated with them. Type 8, assemblage structure change in the stream.
Wow. So the terrestrial tree fundamentally rewired the aquatic food web next door.
Precisely. A clear cross-ecosystem impact chain, driven by changes in mass, leaf litter, and energy light transfer between land and the water. You'd completely miss that if you didn't look at both systems together. But the framework encourages tracking those fundamental flows.
Okay, we've really established the scope and the detail of this new framework. Now let's get to the bottom line. Section 5, the practical implications. So what? What does this all mean for the managers on the ground, the people actually trying to deal with these invasions with limited time and money?
Well, I think the absolute core value proposition here is that by clearly separating the mechanism, the cause, from the impact, the consequence, It allows for much more accurate triage of management options.
Triage meaning prioritizing what to tackle first.
Exactly. If you know precisely which impact you're seeing, are we talking about a type 5 genetic diversity loss, or a type 17 fire regime change, or a type 4 population decline, you can then target your intervention much more effectively towards addressing that specific consequence.
Right. So if a manager just sees, say, a native plant declining and vaguely labels the problem as competition from an invader, they might pour resources into just trying to weed out the invader.
Mhm.
But if they use this framework and identify the primary impact as, say, type 5 genetic diversity loss because the invader is hybridizing with the native.
Then simply weeding might not be enough or even the right strategy.
Exactly. Their management might need to shift radically towards something like protecting genetically pure native populations, maybe collecting seeds for a gene bank or even controlled burns if the hybridization is linked to disturbance. It focuses the strategy.
Precisely. And because this impact-centered typology standardizes the language used in reporting, it makes it much easier to compare results across different studies and regions. If everyone globally uses the same definition for species loss, type 7, or altered fire regime, type 17,
Then we can finally start comparing apples to apples when looking at management effectiveness. Did strategy X work better against type 17 impacts in Australia than strategy Y did in California?
yes, it moves us away from purely anecdotal accounts or species-specific case studies towards building a much larger, comparable evidence base about what actually works best against specific types of ecological consequences.
Which is absolutely vital for things like the big global biodiversity targets, like the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework you mentioned. They need standardized indicators to track progress.
Absolutely. This framework provides that standardized foundation for ecological impact indicators related to invasions. It streamlines reporting, makes impacts comparable regardless of which species is causing them, and ultimately should help funnel limited conservation funding towards the interventions most likely to mitigate the most severe, well-defined consequences.
Okay, it sounds incredibly valuable, but like any framework, it surely has nuances or limitations people need to be aware of when using it.
Oh, definitely. No system is perfect, and the authors are upfront about this. One key thing is scale. While the typology itself can be applied at any spatial or temporal scale, you can describe an impact in a single pond or across a whole continent.
Yeah.
Users have to be really careful when comparing impacts reported at different scales.
So an assemblage structure change, type 8, found in one small study plot, isn't directly comparable to the same impact type reported for an entire national park system without considering that difference in scale.
Exactly. The scale of observation and the degree of aggregation need to be explicitly considered when making comparisons or synthesizing results across studies. The framework provides the categories, but context, especially scale, still matters enormously.
And what about detectability? Are some of these impacts just much harder to spot and therefore maybe underreported or under-researched?
That's a huge practical challenge. There's almost certainly a perception bias. Big, visible structural changes like habitat degradation, type 14, maybe an invasive vine smothering trees, or dramatic changes in fire patterns, type 17, these tend to be much more noticeable.
Easier to get photos of, easier to convince funders about?
Right. Compare that to subtle changes at the individual level, like a slight reduction in reproductive fitness, type 1, or complex population-level impacts, like the slow erosion of genetic diversity, type 5. These are much harder to detect, harder to monitor over time, and probably harder to get research funding for.
So there's a risk that we end up focusing management efforts mainly on the most visually obvious impacts, even if some of those less visible, slow-burning impacts are ultimately just as damaging in the long run.
That's the danger. We need to actively design monitoring programs and fund research specifically aimed at detecting those less obvious, perhaps slower acting, impacts across all the levels, not just the ones that grab headlines easily.
That leads us perfectly into the final part, the outstanding questions. If this framework is the new foundation, what are the next big research steps needed to build upon it? Where should the field focus its energy now?
The paper lays out several really key directions, things for researchers and maybe for you listeners to ponder. First, we really need to get better at quantifying the strength of the connections. We have the impact types, but how strongly are they linked to specific mechanisms?
Like, is species loss, type 7, almost always driven primarily by predation, or is competition just as important in many cases?
Exactly. Or how strong is the link between those subtle behavioral changes, type 3 we talked about, and eventual population decline, type 4? We need numbers on those connections.
Okay, quantifying the links. What else?
Understanding the relative importance. Are some of these 19 impact types inherently more important or more damaging to overall ecosystem integrity than others? And crucially, does that ranking change depending on the context?
You mean like, is loss of soil nutrients type 16 a bigger deal in a nutrient-poor desert than in a rich rainforest? Or are certain taxonomic groups, like amphibians maybe, particularly vulnerable to specific impact types compared to others?
Precisely that kind of context dependency. We need to figure out if there are general rules about which impacts matter most, where, and for whom.
And also understanding those consequence chains better.
Yes, absolutely. Can we identify predictable patterns in those impact cascades? Are there certain sequences of impacts that tend to follow each other? If we see impact A, can we predict that impacts B and C are likely to follow?
That gets towards predictive power, which is key for proactive management, right? Rather than just reacting after the damage is done.
Exactly. Which leads to the really big questions about predictability overall. Do the same invasive species tend to have similar types and magnitudes of impacts wherever they invade? Or does the local environment, the specific native community they encounter, play a bigger role in determining the outcome?
The context matters question again.
It's huge in invasion biology. And related to that, can we get better at predicting which native species or functional groups are likely to be most susceptible to particular types of impact? Can we build better risk assessments based not just on the invader's traits, but on the vulnerability of the recipient community to specific functional disruptions?
Lots to explore there. It feels like this framework opens up a whole new, more structured way to ask those critical next-generation questions.
I think it really does.
Yeah. So wrapping up this deep dive, it seems clear that invasion biology is really maturing. It's moving beyond just cataloging which species is where towards a much more systematic, functional analysis of what these species actually do to ecosystems.
Yeah, this new standardized framework, that 19 impact types, the 6 ecological levels, that crucial separation of mechanism and consequence, it feels like a really significant step forward, a necessary one for both the science and the practical management.
It gives everyone involved, from researchers to policymakers to on-the-ground managers, a common language and a much clearer structure for documenting impacts, communicating risks, comparing strategies, and ultimately prioritizing where to put limited resources.
It should hopefully lead to more effective, evidence-based conservation decisions globally.
Okay, so if we accept that understanding this full spectrum of impacts, from the individual to the abiotic, is vital, and we also accept that the same mechanism, like predation by foxes and cats in Australia, can lead to very different impacts, population decline versus range contraction versus extinction, that leaves us with a really challenging thought to end on.
If we now have the tools to clearly categorize both the causes, mechanisms, and the consequences, impacts, what's the next frontier?
It has to be prediction, right? How can we get better at predicting which specific consequence chain that whole cascade from the immediate proximal impact right through to the complex distal ones, like that terrifying fungus to malaria link, is most likely to actually play out when an invader arrives in a completely new environment?
That's the holy grail, isn't it?
Yeah.
Moving from describing damage after the fact to reliably predicting the trajectory of an invasion before it gets out of control.
Mastering that predictive capacity, figuring out which dominoes are most likely to fall and how fast, that feels like the crucial next step if we're serious about protecting native biodiversity in the face of accelerating global change. Something for you to mull over.
Excellent challenge to leave our listeners with.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.